Thank you, Casey. Appreciate it. Well, I would like to welcome you folks, and thank you very much for the introduction, Casey. Thank you very much for the words of our vice president here, whose name I've already forgotten, because my memory as a 91-year-old ain't so good. As Casey suggested, it is a privilege to be here. And as he also suggested, it is a talk which I would categorize as a warning talk, because when things went so bad during the Nazi period in Germany, it was because the people prior to that period had not done their civic job of being politically involved and speaking up. So this is a call to you to vote whenever voting is required. It just happened, and a good many people came out, and that's good. And to speak to other folks and to exchange ideas and your positions, political, with other folks. This is what it's all about, to be a citizen and to listen to other people and to make our country a better country. So before I share with you some of my experiences during this Nazi period, I would, after I've already told you why I'm here, tell you a little bit more about why I'm here, okay? As you heard, I'm 91 years old, so there isn't much time left for me to share with other people my ideas and my experiences and my story. So I have to get on the ball and do this as often as I can. And people like Casey make this possible. And so I'm very grateful to you, Casey, really. Very few Holocaust survivors are still alive today because we are dying out at a ever faster rate, which of course makes sense. When I say this to some folk, they say, well, I don't know how long I'll be around. Well, that's true, but that person's chance is better than mine when I'm 91 years old. Correct? I have the math correct, right? Okay. So, you know, every person alive, I think, every normal person alive, hopes that something like the Holocaust will not occur again, obviously. We don't want a repetition of that. And as you perhaps guessed by now, I've been speaking to thousands of people, thousands of young people in middle schools and high schools and universities and organizations and what have you. And practically after every lecture I gave, there is the same question that somebody asks, and that question is, Dr. Ziffer, is it possible that something like this could happen here in our country? Now, let me tell you that I would love to be able to say no to that question, but having gone through what I went through, I have no choice but to respond with usually a muted yes, it is possible. And this yes answer is a scary answer. It is scary to me. It should be scary to you. And this is really also why I'm here. For you, perhaps, to be able to ask that question, and for me to give you that answer. But there's another reason why I can say, yes, it is possible. And the reason for that is that the people who committed these incredible crimes that I witnessed and that I lived with for, well, 3 years during the Holocaust, that all these people were human beings, just as you and I are just human beings, normal people. We have the same genetic makeup as we sit here, as the people who committed these crimes. Our DNA is the same their DNA happened to be. So our genetic makeup is the same. So the possibilities thus are the same also. They listen to propaganda, and that propaganda very often, most of the time, consisted of lies that streamed daily, I mean daily, from the government, in printed form or in radio form. Television wasn't available at that time yet. Social media took care of it. And let me tell you something, and take it to heart, that when one hears lies long enough, one starts believing those lies. That is a harsh thing that I said, but I lived through it and I saw it. I saw it happening. These lies, particularly when they come from an authoritative source, those lies sink in and they become part of us. And if heard long enough, as I said, from these sources of authority, one begins believing and acting upon them. And this is what happened in Germany during the Nazi period. People acted upon these lies that they heard. Scary. So one way to resist these lies is practicing what is commonly called critical thinking. Now, you are here. You have a wonderful opportunity. I'm speaking to the students primarily who are here now, to learn what critical thinking is all about and to apply it in our day, in every day, past, present, and future. Critical thinking was, is, and will be a very important part of our mandate of being citizens of a good country, critical thinking. So in our difficult time that was mentioned before by Casey, my advice to you, my friends, is do not trust people who suggest that they alone have the answers to complex issues. And some of these issues, I do bring this up before I get into my own story, is the question of immigration. And this is a real problem that we are facing and that we have to deal with. Whom should we allow to come to this country? Is it just the rich or also the poor? Is it just white people or white people from Scandinavia, I should say, or also people of color, refugees who seek safety and a better life, etc., etc., etc. Real problems that have to be dealt with. So for your information, I want you to know that I, who stand here and talk to you, was also a refugee. I was a refugee from communism, from Czechoslovakia, and I arrived here dirt poor. I mean, I had a $5 bill in my pocket that my father had bought in Europe. The other crucial problems that we face, there's this whole problem of global warming that comes to the surface in all of our conversations, radio, television, and that's just one of them. But our careless use of fossil fuels and the dangerous emissions, of course, the glaciers are now melting, and the level of the oceans are rising. And I want to hear from you an example, a personal example. We have in our congregation in Asheville an elderly couple, a bit younger than I am, but nevertheless, the 70s, I guess, or maybe 80s. And these two people who happen to be our friends used to spend a vacation on a small island in the Caribbean every year, but this past year, they could no longer do so because the whole island had disappeared, had sunk. Now that's a fact. That's not something I'm pulling out of my pocket here to convince you. I was absolutely flabbergasted when I heard this. An island, they had done some fishing there and sailing there and what have you, stayed in a hotel there. It's gone. No longer on the map. So I think our lack of decisive actions to minimize or stop the rise of the ocean levels has already resulted, among other things, in the regrettable, terrible disappearance of many species. Let's keep that in mind, okay? I would suggest that we listen to our scientists. And some of you guys, students here, are going to be scientists. That's why you're here. That we take the findings of these scientists seriously. Very, very important. And reject claims, please, from sort of self-appointed stable geniuses who smugly claim to know better than science. Science is serious. And what amazes me is that these people who do not believe in science take their pills to stay, say, asleep during the night. Science has made that pill. And if you drive to AB Tech in your car, science had something to do with it. And I like to add engineering because my first field of education was engineering. I'm very proud of that, and some of it sticks with me still today. My wife and I are cancer survivors. And guess what helped us to be still alive? If it wasn't science, I don't know what it was. It was science, very differently, very seriously so. So these are things that we need to keep in mind. And this is part of what I call critical thinking that helps you make decisions as you go to the polls, but also in your everyday life. Very, very important. And so the other thing, as an American now, and when I say as an American now, I want to tell you that I'm eternally grateful to have come to America, a great, great country that doesn't have to be made greater and greater, okay? It is a great country. I vouch for that as I speak before you. So I'm tired of fear-mongering that has become almost a daily thing in this country. And I also reject the immigration phobia that we are hearing about constantly. I'm an immigrant myself, and it's because of the goodness of America that has accepted me that I stand before you today. So immigration phobia is crazy. And I reject incitement and hate, encouragement that led actually to the killing of those 11 people in Pittsburgh, and that led also to this morning's killing of 12 people and injuring 10 people, and among these was one police officer in California. So let's do critical thinking and see where some of the things that we're experiencing come from and how they affect us and how they make out of us people smaller, lesser than we should be as Americans. So I would like to end this very preparatory talk before I go into my own story. We need to listen to the past and what happened in the past. Those years from 1933 to 1945 that I lived through were terrible years, and particularly the years from 1939 to 1945, and even worse from 1942 to 1945. 1942, by the way, is when Auschwitz started really producing the results it produced. Millions of people just murdered, okay? all this is possible because you and I have the same DNA as those people who built those gas chambers and ovens in which we were sort of transformed into smoke that went out through chimneys. Let's keep that in mind. And I'm so happy that I have the opportunity to tell you about this, thanks to the leadership here in the school. So this is why I'm here then tonight, to share with you an important part of my life. Perhaps we can all learn from that for our daily lives and for decisions we have to make in the future. And these decisions will undoubtedly be upon us before long. So I think all of you know that Holocaust means 6 million dead. Not just dead, but murdered, okay? And among these 6 millions were 14 people in my own family. And I could tell you a little bit about each one of these persons and that person's history, but we don't have time for that. Among those 6 million were 1.5 million children. And when you talk 6 million, you know this is a 6 with 6 zeros behind there. So you know it's a number. A number doesn't usually, doesn't really affect us on a very deep level. But that number should, because if you put this into some kind of a comparative system, think about it as almost 100 times the whole population of Asheville that was murdered. How's that? No, I mean, it's just incredible. That's when numbers come alive, when you make this kind of comparisons. So that happened within 3 or 4 years toward the end of the war, before the end of the war, I should say. And these were not just Jewish people, by the way. There were also between 60,000 and 80,000 gypsies, human beings just like you and I, who live a different lifestyle, to be sure. Those people were murdered too. And there were Jehovah's Witnesses. We have churches of Jehovah's Witnesses in this country. I know a number of people who worship there. They too were murdered. And communists and all kind of people who simply did not agree with Hitler's ideology, okay? They went to the deaths. So, how did it all begin with us? I've heard other Holocaust survivors speak, needless to say, and very often what I've heard is something like this. Well, we had a good life in Europe. Everything went hunky-dory, you know. And then one day we woke up and the whole thing had changed. We were suddenly in a different universe, as it were. Well said, but not correct. Because anti-Semitism. I would like for you to raise your hands if you know what the word anti-Semitism means. Would you do that? Well, just about almost everybody does, or did, or does know. Anti-Semitism has been around for 20 centuries, and I've done a lot of work myself on this crazy, totally irrational phenomenon. I will not go into the details. That would take us too long, and that really would be in need of a special lecture or a series of lectures. It's a pretty complicated matter. But what I'm trying to say again, that beginning that way is wrong. It's been around. I'll give you an example. I was 7 or 8 years old. I don't remember just exactly how old I was at that time. In my hometown in Czechoslovakia at that time. And I had a friend whose name was Jacob Katz. He was a Jewish guy, kid, 8 years old, like I. And we used to go to school together and come home also together. He was dressed a little bit differently from me because he was a Hasidic Jew. He had his hair, he has his head always covered, for instance, even in class. And that was fully accepted because Czechoslovakia was a democratic country, perhaps the most democratic country in Europe at that particular time. And so through our town, we had roughly, between 20 and 30,000 inhabitants. There were railroad lines that sort of divided the town into two parts. And to get from one side of these lines to the other, one had to step down. There were some stairs leading down, and it was like a little tunnel-like situation, and then stairs up again. We were on the other side. So Jacob and I, one day, returned that way, and down in the dark part, in the tunnel part, the rocks were flying at us. And we heard screaming, Žid, Žid, špinavý Židek. Anybody speaking Czech here? No. So what does Žid mean? Jew. Špinavý Židek means filthy little Jew. And the rocks were flying, and we started running. He to the right, I to the left. I saved myself behind the glass doors leading to an apartment house, and he just kept on running. I noticed that. I was afraid for him, obviously. They didn't follow me, the kids. And just before he was caught by this mob of kids, there came running down the street the fellow who was generally called the town idiot. Now in America, this wouldn't happen, I would say. There are no town idiots in our country. But there, this was a challenged person, both physically and mentally, who cleaned up the trash in the streets, the leftovers from the horses that pulled the wagons, and so forth and so on. He had a two-wheeled wagon. He arrived galloping toward Jacob, picked him up, put him on his little carriage, and galloped away. And the kids were left behind. We found out later, deposited him in front of his parents' house. His father was a tailor. Now I ask you, where did these kids who were shouting Žid and špinavý Židek, where did they learn this from? Any guesses? Well, where could they have learned from? 8 years old. Parents, teachers, preachers, family members, I don't know. But that's where it came from. There's no question about that. And they acted it out, because words, if you hear them long enough, sink in, and they made you an active anti-Semite in this particular case. They can make other bad people out of you, but this was anti-Semitism. So, coming back, anti-Semitism did exist. It wasn't just you wake up and the world has changed. So let's go on a little bit. That on September 1st, 1939, World War II broke out. In 1938, our particular part, a province of Czechoslovakia, was annexed by Poland. Poland was across the river Olza from us. We were in a border town, okay? So in 1938, our allies, you might say, England and France, had abandoned us Czechs and had given Hitler permission, okay, to annex a huge part of Czechoslovakia called the Sudeten country. So the Czechs, Czechoslovakia was on its knees. We were undone. Poland took advantage of that, and here we come. We annexed the little part that has a lot of coal mines and steel factories. They annexed us, okay? So on September 1st, 1939, the first day of World War II, we were overrun by the German army. There wasn't a shot fired, really. And we had become occupied. After the army had come through, the German army, the Poles had retreated. There came the German army in perfect order. going east toward Poland. I want to remind you that the war against Poland lasted altogether 2 weeks. It was called the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. And then came the SS. Have you heard of the SS? Some of you have. It was a paramilitary organization, black uniforms. They were the real supporters of Hitler. And part of the SS was the Gestapo, which was the German secret police. They came in last, and they occupied us, and we Jews were suddenly under German rule. Well, let me tell you just a little bit about that first night. The night from September 1st to September 2nd. I was a kid, okay? I couldn't sleep. I woke up at probably 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning. It was still dark. And I couldn't fall asleep again. And there was something in the air that bothered me. So I went in search of my dad, because my dad and I were the best of friends. He was my role model. And to my amazement, I didn't find my dad sleeping next to my mom, where he usually slept. I finally found him on a balcony in the back of our house. We lived on the second floor of an apartment building. He just stood there, and his face was white as snow. Never seen him like that before. I walked up to him and said, "Daddy, what's going on?" And he said, they called me Walti, for Walter, you know. "Walti, come over here." He put his hands on my head and on my shoulders and said, "Listen." And so I listened. And the sounds I heard were not familiar to me at all. There was shouting, there was screaming, there were things being broken, things like glass possibly. There were big thumps of other things that were demolished. And I looked at my dad and said, "What's going on, Daddy?" And he said, "I think they are burning our synagogue." Does everybody here know what a synagogue is? Yes. Well, this didn't sink in, really. It didn't. And there were ashes in the air. And the sun suddenly came out behind the neighboring roofs. And I said to my dad, "Daddy, look, the sun's coming up." And my dad, in a whispered voice, said to me, "Walti, the sun is coming up, but I think our sun is setting." It was a prophetic statement. The next morning, we went to see what had happened, and our synagogue, one of two impressive, beautiful buildings with stained glass windows, were completely demolished. I mean, some of the walls were still standing. The rest had always crashed in. The women's gallery was down. And most of all, the scrolls, which are the center of any synagogue, the holy scrolls, I should say, Genesis to Deuteronomy, from which we read on the Shabbat, on Saturday, during holy days, all over the place, still emitting stench, still burning, some of them. Total destruction. Well, I have to say I was not too terribly impressed. I was a kid. I did not understand the deeper meaning of what had happened, really. I saw a building that had collapsed. But there was something that did impress me tremendously, and that was the fact that the people who came and stood around and looked at this destroyed building never said hello to us, didn't seem to recognize my dad, who happened to be an attorney in town, who was also the president of the Jewish congregation and of the Jewish province, people of the province, very well known, did not know us. Either looked away or walked by us. And then I heard little sort of statements that carried to us anyway. They were supposed to be hushed statements, I guess. Well, it finally happened. Shouldn't they have expected this? And stuff like that, meaning we Jews. Well, synagogue was gone. But think about it now. Why are always places of worship that are being attacked? There's a deeper meaning to that. I'll let you figure that out yourselves. That was September 2nd, 1939. And from then on, things went fast. So I'm scrolling forward just a little bit. Within just a few days, the edict came out that all Jewish people had to be identified by white armbands with a blue Star of David. It's a six-pointed star that was imprinted on those bands. And if you go online and if you Google me, there's a picture of myself and a friend of mine, and you'll see the band that we both are wearing. Well, what's so terrible about wearing a band, being a Jew? Well, there is something terrible about this, and that is that people didn't want to speak to us. People didn't want to be seen with us. My mom, as most moms in this world, tried to find, are charged to find provisions for the families, cooks, you know. My mom was a wonderful cook, by the way. And so it was a problem going to the market because the farmers who came in, refused to talk with her, to sell anything to her. Being seen with a Jew was not a good thing for these folks. Well, my mom had a lot of friends among the farmers. She was a very outgoing person, and she was liked. And so we really never went hungry. She always managed to get something from these farmers who came to town. And then came the evictions. So we lived in a nice apartment on the second floor of a home and evicted. What can you take with you? 2 suitcases. Well, the place was filled with furniture that my parents had bought. We had a few Persian rugs there. My mom had all kinds of souvenirs and stuff, porcelain. You know, you all have that in your homes too, I imagine. All that had to be left there, out, within 2-3 days. And so we moved into another apartment owned by an uncle who owned an apartment house about 2 blocks from where we lived. Now that apartment of my uncle's had 3 people in it, him, his wife, and his daughter, my cousin Ilse. And then 2 of Elsa's, my uncle's wife's parents came in, and that made it 5 people. And then we came in with 4 people, and that made it 15 people. And well, you can imagine how things sort of deteriorate as far as one's life is concerned. So we stayed there, and before long we were evicted from there. Again, went to another place across the river. More people squeezed together, and finally we ended up in a ghetto, evicted from there too, going into a ghetto on the periphery of our town. This was an abandoned entertainment complex with dance halls and all abandoned stuff, and a couple of restaurants and what have you. So just short of 1,000 Jewish people squeezed into a hall. Now just imagine this hall being square. The people put up wires going from one side to the wall to the other, and that way, laterally and longitudinally. And they hung things on these wires to provide for each square that was created a little bit of privacy. And of course, there weren't enough toilets for the people. It was just an absolutely miserable life. There was a stage in front. My family lived in the middle of the stage, and we had 2 families on each side. Now, what I forgot to tell you is that very shortly after the Nazis came into our town, the bell rang in our apartment. And let me tell you, normally when a person came, pushed the button and then waited, you know. The front door was closed. Well, when the Gestapo came, we found that out. They kept the finger on the bell until people came to open the door. That was just an introduction for us. This is the Gestapo waiting. And so they came and took my father with him by car. And we were, of course, totally helpless. We had no idea how long my father would be absent, if indeed at all he'd return. Well, he returned. And he walked in, he had a smile on his face. My father was an extremely educated person in every field that you can imagine. But he was also naive, as many of us were, because we had no idea what Nazism was all about. And so he comes back smilingly. And my mom and my sister and I, my sister Edith, what's going on, Daddy? What happened? Oh, we went to a hotel with a glass of beer with this SS person. And, well, he said, from now on, Dr. Ziffer, he called him Dr. Ziffer, you're going to be the representative of the Jews in your town, and the middleman with a group that you're going to assemble, and Judenrat, as it was called, to be the middleman between the Jewish community and the Gestapo. Well, you couldn't say no to that. That would have been the end of your life. So he said, okay. So my father had the privilege with his family to live in the middle on the stage there, you know, overseeing the rest of these people. And there were 2 or 3 of these big halls, dance halls there, that finally accommodated 1,000 people, just short of 1,000 people. Well, ghetto life, needless to say, it was no picnic, but I do want to tell you that for me, in the middle of this misery, there was happiness. Now, you didn't expect that to hear, but it was. Because while playing ping pong on a sort of simple kind of table put together of pieces of wood and 2x4s, I fell in love with a young woman. Her name was Lydia, and she was gorgeous. And she had golden hair, and she was sweet as can be. And every time she lost a game of ping pong, she didn't play very well, she just laughed, and it sounded to me like a silver bell going off. Cling, 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 you know, wonderful. So I was hopelessly in love. Now, what more do you expect, for Pete's sakes? You know, that overrides everything else, even absolute misery. And so my father made it possible for the young people of our town to work in a bolt and nut factory, a 45 minutes train ride from our town. And when this sort of thing happened, when the Jews were successful in getting employment in a war-related industry, we knew that that would somehow slow down the possibility of deportation, that we'd probably stay in our town a bit longer before we're kicked out and sent to a concentration camp. And so there were about 40 of us, and Lydia and I had our sandwiches. We went down on the guard to the station, and then on the train, and come midnight, you know, we had our sandwich together, so separately from the other people, because we held hands. And anyway, it was a lovely time. And so it went for several weeks. And then one evening, Lydia came to the stage where we stayed and said, Walter, I have bad news. And what was the bad news? The bad news was that her parents decided clandestinely to leave the ghetto, to flee, basically, and to then march or get some transportation east toward Soviet Russia, because Soviet Russia at that time was still a haven for Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. And so we both wept, and we embraced, and we cried. And Lydia took from her gold chain a little emblem I will not, I can show you a copy of it that I still carry in my keychain. And when you twisted a little plate, it was gold, said, "I love you." And so she said, Valti, she called me Valti also, of course. Whatever may come, you'll have that this little thing that will help you remember me. And then we'll be back in a few weeks and we'll continue dating. Well, about 10 days later, there were some Jews wandering around, totally disoriented, came to my father and said, "Dr. Ziffer, I got bad news for you." "What is it?" Well, they found a couple with a daughter shot dead, 10 kilometers east of the city. And they found out it was Lydia and her parents. Well, that, let me just tell you, was the first truly traumatic moment for me, which I will never, never forget. It's engraved in here, and I have a copy of that little thing that she gave me, that golden little thing on my keychain. Things didn't get any better. And on the 28th of June, 1942, the guards that circled the ghetto on motorcycles and with trucks and what have you, the loudspeakers there, and announced to us to get ready the following day for a transfer. We would be transferred to a place east. So my mom, it's always the moms who do this, prepared one suitcase per person, and the next morning we were ready. On the next morning, I saw roughly 1,000 Jewish people, each person with a suitcase, come down, of course, with guards both sides, dogs around, yapping. And we went to a junkyard, and there were tables, long tables with SS soldiers behind the table, with whips and handguns on the table, commanding us to hand over all of our valuables. And some of us did, some of us didn't. Some of us were caught and beaten up because they had not handed everything over. But to make a long story short, we were eventually divided up. Men and women separated. Men, old people, middle-aged people, and young people. Women, old ladies, middle-aged, and young people. And I want to stop here for a moment and put a parenthesis into my talk, because that was done to the migrants on our southern border. And let me tell you, in my opinion, I'm a Jew, and I'm also a biblical scholar. To me, the relationship between a mother and her child is something absolutely holy. There's nothing holier for me than that. And that was done by our government. And we were recently in Florida to visit with my family down there, and we're given a report by a lawyer from the Jewish congregation down there, who is obviously an immigration lawyer, who went to a town in Texas. And I am not going to go into details here. And she saw, actually, how these people were treated. And I just want to find this thing here just to tell you what this was called. It was called the South Texas Family Residential Center. Okay? And it had 2,400 beds in the facility. And that's not a residential center. It is a jail, basically. And this report tells us in detail what this lady saw and brought back. Now that, to me, sort of broke the camel's back politically. I have to admit this to you. This is not a political speech. But for any government to do this thing, to separate children from their parents, is absolutely inadmissible, as far as I'm concerned. This is when we hit bottom in our moral stance. And it is un-Jewish, and it is un-American. And I think we should remember that. Thank you. Well, the trains came eventually. We were put on trains, and we went destination unknown. Just boys like myself. My voice is starting to shake a little bit. I hope it doesn't bother you. But when I come to that subject, I just sort of fall apart. Anyway, so there was on the train, there was crying and weeping. We didn't know where we were headed. And I guess the train went for about maybe an hour and a half. Came to a stop, and we were unloaded. The unloading process was always the same on trains and on trucks. You've seen wagons that are opened and closed with these sliding doors on both sides. Well, when the train stopped, both sliding doors were opened, and there were SS soldiers who simply pushed the people out. Now, there were young people there, but you know, when you're pushed out, you don't have control over what happens. It's a chaotic situation. So people fell out of the train. Some people jumped on them. It was just a nightmare. The dogs were there barking, what have you. Finally, the SS got some order into the situation and got us into a marching order, and we marched off. And we came to our first slave labor camp. These weren't concentration camps yet at that particular point. This was a camp by the name of Sakrau. I went through I was sent through 7 slave labor and concentration camps. And the people asked me, why did they do this to you? What's the point? Well, I have no idea. Germany was possessed with anti-Semitism, and some scholars have even suggested that if they had just put you on a train without all these transfers, Germany may have even won the war, because the train system in Germany was completely blocked up by these trains carrying prisoners here and there and everywhere. And the soldiers who should have gotten to the Eastern Front or to the Western Front were blocked also because of the trains of prisoners. They were crisscrossing Germany. I don't know whether that's true or not. To make a long story short, 7 camps. There were some better ones and some worse ones. The first camp was still, I was still fresh from home. My mom was a good cook, I mentioned to you, and she managed to feed us while in the ghetto, one way or another. But there were people there who had already been there for several years, and they felt differently about those camps. Let me just say, and I cannot go into details about all these 7 camps, we'll run out of time, but let me just tell you very quickly that the treatment that we had to undergo was absolutely unbelievable. In terms of food rations, we had between 10 and 12, some say 14 ounces of bread per day. And that was it, okay? With that, we were given a black liquid. They called it coffee, but even the Germans had no coffee anymore at that particular point. So it was lukewarm, bitter water. At noon at the construction site where we worked, they brought out kettles with soup that were made out of peels, beet peels, and potato peels. And depending on whether the guy who dished out the soup, whether he liked you or didn't like you, these were all prisoner things, people who did this, whether he went in down with a label when he saw a friend, well, you had in your bowl a lot of peels, some solids, obviously. But then a little kid like myself, well, who needs that little kid? I really had no friends in any of those camps, I must say that. So you take the table from the top and you get a bowl of soup, yes. Lukewarm water with a few peels of potato or beet swimming around there. Now, when you get that for 3 years, you can imagine what happens to your body. And when I came out of it, I weighed 87 pounds, and I was a skeleton. And my mind did not function properly. Other people didn't come out. They had a worse experience than I, obviously. They were murdered, or they died of exhaustion. So 7 camps. So let me tell you about 2 camps, and that are quite different from each other. The second camp was a camp by the name of Brande, B-R-A-N-D. You can find that online if you'd like to look this up. And when we arrived in Brande, it was almost Christmas. We trudged through the snow from the time where we were unloaded to the camp. And on the horizon, I saw, well, little houses with little lights in them, which I interpreted as Christmas tree lights. And there was even some music wafting over to us, like Silent Night, Holy Night. And I was absolutely undone. I was still, a little kid. I was 15 at that point. I was 16, I'm sorry. And it reminded me of my time at home. And here I'm going through snow that deep to a slave labor camp. Well, Brande was known by some of the older prisoners who had been there as a recuperation camp. People who somehow became very weak, maybe sick, were sent to Brande supposedly, to wait out a bit of time, and then to be healed, and then to be sent back to work. So as we entered into the gate of Brande, I heard a guy behind us say, "Oh, well, that's going to be good. Well, we're really lucky." Well, I was in Brande probably 5 to 6 months. And Brande turned out to be an extermination camp. No, not like Auschwitz, not with gas. But for the people who underwent that extermination, maybe even worse. And here's what happened. There was roll call every morning when we lined up 5 deep rows. And the Wachhabender, which means the head of the guards, whose name was Kurt Pompe, P-O-M-P-E, came out, all with their sidearms, of course, and their whips. And he would walk through the lines, look at each one of us. And then he would look at one person and take his whip and hit him over the head or the shoulder. That person had to step out. And having done this through all the prisoners, I cannot tell you how many prisoners were there, but there were several hundred. That group of 10 to 12 people was marched off to what we called the wash barracks. And then we were dismissed, and cleaning sidewalks and cleaning our rooms, and et cetera, et cetera. And then we heard screaming. And I, of course, didn't know what was going on. I asked one of the prisoners, "Can you tell me what's going on?" The guy looked at me, said nothing, walked away. So I didn't learn anything. And then one day, I was digging a hole to put some 2x4 or something in there, fence, I don't remember. A capo, which is a camp policeman, a fellow prisoner, with 2 young people each side, came up to me and said, "Follow me." And I followed him to the wash barrack. And what I saw, I cannot convey to you, because there's no language available to tell you what I saw. What I saw was 10 or 12 corpses lying in filth, in excrement, in urine, and in blood, and in water, in all kind of configurations, and one here, one there, etc. I didn't understand. I understand. They were killed, obviously. How? I had no idea. We were we were told to take these corpses, to put them on a 2-wheeled wagon, to take them to the adjoining forest, beautiful forest, to dump them into a mass grave, which we did. We were taken back, marched back to camp, and we cleaned up the mess. Time went by, and I had some contacts with my fellow prisoners, who were all older than I, and the second time I asked them, can you tell me what happened? And that person seemingly knew what had happened and told me that Mr. Pompey, the head of the guards, a sadistic person, unbelievably sadistic, who enjoyed people, seeing people suffering, with his guards, would give these men, young people, ice-cold showers, and the showers were always ice-cold, but there were also big vats of boiling water in that wash barrack in which we, the prisoners, boiled the underwear of the guards, of the German guards. Boiling underwear was done in those days. My mom did that for us as well. Well, the kind of murder that went on consisted of ice-cold showers, and then people being doused by boiling water and being beaten. And you can imagine that the people, in trying to save themselves, would run around with the laughing guards, sadistic people, doing this kind of work until the people expired. Well, I don't think Hitler invented that particular method of killing, but let me again tell you what, and I repeat to you, that if you hear lies long enough, you buy into it, you act on it, and these people acted on the mantra, kill Jews. And so there's something else that I want to leave with you. In the reading information about concentration camps in that period of time, you will probably hear about camps that were work camps, camps that were death camps, and camps that were extermination camps. Now, this is all true to establish these categories. It makes sense in a sense. But every camp that we were in was a death camp, was an extermination camp. Every one of them. Because the end point for every Jew that was taken into a camp was death. Now, there are all kinds of ways you can accomplish that, obviously. But the end point is murder. And I am very fortunate to stand before you here, alive, because every one of the people that were deported with me as a youngster didn't make it beyond Brande, the second camp. They all died there. They all died murdered. So this is not a very good, happy story. But let me tell you another story that could be a bit educational. From Brande, we went to another camp. We were sent to another camp by the name of Graditz, Graditz, and that was an Air Force station, like Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio, where I lived. It's a city in itself. And we moved furniture and we moved big machinery from one place to another. And there were no SS there. These were Air Force soldiers that supervised this. Well, in a town like this, it was a city, as I said, there were garbage cans. And these soldiers didn't mind for us scrounging through these garbage cans. And that's exactly what we did. And I'm not exaggerating to you when I tell you right now that we find in these garbage cans sandwiches, partly eaten, partially eaten sandwiches. And some of this bread had turned green, as it usually does. You may have found that out yourself. And we ate that stuff. And it was delectable. And I did not get sick from it. I still don't understand that. I've shared this with doctors here in the country, And they just looked at me and said, how is that possible? Well, I didn't. So that, you see, I called a good camp because I had garbage. One more camp that I want to describe to you was Schmiedeberg. That was a concentration camp already. A mountain that was hollowed out, in which there was established a factory to build V1s and V2s. These were missiles, not guided missiles, but unguided missiles, projectiles that were shot into England. And I had the job of bending rebars on a machine. Good job, because the machine did the work. I just pushed the pedal. Now, a guy had been killed on that same machine before I was promoted to run that machine, because that machine is a flat, big table with all kinds of holes and things that you had to stick into these holes. Had a big arm, and that arm moved beyond the table when it pulled the bar and bent it. And my predecessor was caught between the part that stuck out and the table, and his thigh was smashed to smithereens, and he lost his conscience, of course, and he was taken away. So I was promoted to run that machine. So at one point, the engineer who ran this sort of thing came to me and said, follow me. I followed him to his little office. And in his office, he pulled out a blueprint, put it on the table, and said, now you're going to no longer bend the rebars in the fashion that you've done this, but in this fashion, which is now before you, the blueprint. Well, I was a pretty smart little kid. I mean, I hadn't been introduced yet to differential equations, which I did in my engineering studies, but I knew arithmetic. I knew that 2 and 2 is 4, you know. And so on a blueprint like this, you have dimensions for this, for this, for this, okay? Several dimensions of the bent parts. And then a total dimension for the whole, for the bent rebar. And so I added up quickly. It was very simple, these different dimensions. And the different dimensions added up did not add up to the total that the blueprint suggested. And I said to the man, I remember German is my native language. I told him, sir, there's something wrong with this blueprint. These things don't add up. And the man behind his desk sat there and shook his head. Didn't say anything. And I wait. You know, I have my blue, white, striped, pajama type uniform on, scared to death. I stand in front of the desk. And he finally said, that's impossible. Das ist unmöglich. He said, this is impossible. You're not a Jew. I said, excuse me, sir, but I am a Jew. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm wearing what I'm wearing, you know. And again, silence. Nein, das ist ganz unmöglich. This is totally impossible. You're not a Jew. So I stand there, you know, and wait. And finally I said, why? Why do you think so? And he said to me, because Jews are not capable of speaking German. Now let that sink in. That's education, okay? People in Germany were taught that we were what's called Untermenschen, which means underhumans. We did not belong to the species that I see before you, before me, right here. We were something lower. You know, we had not developed from ape to human. We were somewhere in the middle. And those people in the middle just aren't capable of speaking German. Well, you know, I had nothing to say. What can I say to the man? I'm a prisoner. And so I stood there. He got up, walked to the cupboard, opened his lunchbox, and gave me half his sandwich that his wife probably had prepared for him, and then took me back to my machine. Education, that's what I'm talking about. I hope that you are all aware of the blessing that you people have, talking to the students, obviously, of being in this kind of a school, where you do learn about critical thinking, where you do learn about what you're going to be, but in a decent way. I hope you can always keep that in front of you and remind yourselves of the blessing that you are in a good country, that you have the privilege of going to a good school. Many people in the world don't have that privilege, that I can tell you. So I'm coming to the end now. I'm not going to drag you through the other camps, which are miserable. I might tell you, though, before I go there, is one other thing, and that is that we were deprived of our humanity in addition to what I've just told you. After one of the entrances into a new camp, where we were usually forced into a wash barrack, we had the shower, and the cold shower, our clothes was taken away from us, and we were given these blue, white striped pajamas. So I took my little bundle, and there was a pair of pants, there were 4 pieces of cloth that size that were used as socks, there were shoes, wooden shoes with cloth tops, there were pants, of course, no underwear, there was a shirt, there was a little jacket, all made of stuff of such a loose weave that if I had it before me and looked at you, I'd see you right through the textile, right through that fabric. And a little hat, also a blue-white hat. But on the jacket, in front here and in back, there was a number. And that number was 64,757 for me. I had lost my name. Of course, they cut off your hair everywhere you went. No, hair goes gone. It sort of identifies you a little bit. We all looked alike, you know, and we all had become numbers. Now, I ask the students very often, what's behind that? Why numbers? Why take away your name? And every so often, there is a smart fellow, a smart young woman there who says, I know. What is it? You become an object. You are no longer a human being. But as you become an object, objects can be handled in any old way, right? I can take this microphone and break it. I can take this and kick it over. That's objects. So I became a number. And from then on, my name was no longer used, and we just became non-people. On May 8th, 1945, I was in a camp by the name of Waldenburg, which was southwest of the city of Breslau, which is now Wrocław and belongs to Poland, actually. And we were digging holes into bedrock. That was our work on a construction site in bitter cold weather. I mean bitter cold, way below freezing. And of course the barracks were heated, but insufficiently. That particular camp, we marched to work and through Main Street of the city of Waldenburg. And I looked up into the apartment building windows, and I saw the Venetian blinds moving now and then, and people peeking out. Or there was noises. There were dogs barking. There were the guards shouting and shouting just all kind of ugly stuff at us, insulting us. And there were shots being fired too. And as we walked through Main Street, past a big church, gray building, we saw a person running out from behind the church, And that person, man, woman, I have no idea, threw a package into the ranks of us prisoners. And I happened to catch that package. And feverishly, of course, I ripped it open. There were hands all around me trying to wrest this package from me. But I managed to get a little piece of 2 slices of dark bread with a little margarine in between into my mouth. And let me tell you, this was a precious gift. Maybe it helped me to live 2 or 3 hours longer. But I remember the best of cakes you can buy now would not get anywhere close to how I felt eating that bite of bread. Shots rang out at that point, and we marched on, and we went to a construction site and dug the holes, which was an absolutely miserable job. And then marched home to the camp. And before going onto our bunk beds, which were filled with straw, we deloused ourselves because we were infested with lice. And these lice would dig into under our skin. And so we deloused each other. We stood there naked in the cold, trying to pull the lice out. Because if you were to leave the louse under your skin, you'd become infected, depending on, well, anywhere on your body. But depending on where this would happen, you'd be unable to work. And if you're unable to work, there was no use for a person. Did I say person? No. For the object, 64,757. And so we pulled our lice out, and then we crawled into our bunks. Well, I did notice as I took off my shoe that the outside of my right shoe had been damaged. It was frayed area there. But I didn't pay any attention. Because at that point, after having been in the camps for 3 years, my mind no longer worked. Got back into the bunk and slept. Well, exhausted. Next morning, got up, went to work, exhausted, ended up more exhausted, slept again. But I noticed that my foot had become a little green around that area where the shoe had been somehow reached. And then another day or two, I don't remember exactly, and then I couldn't get my foot into my shoe anymore because the shoe just was too small for the foot that had swollen. And so there was a little hospital in this camp with 2 Dutch Jewish doctors, prisoners. I went up there and I showed this to them, and they said, "Oh my gosh, this is bad. This is really bad." They cleaned out the wound. They had alcohol, they had aspirin, and they had scalpels. That's all they had. And when they poured alcohol over my foot, I went practically through the ceiling. I mean, that was a terrible moment. Well, they hid me in that little hospital under the bunk beds, under one bunk bed, having the bed covers, the blankets, hang down on all 4 sides. How they managed to count the next morning, I don't know. But they did somehow. And here I was hidden there. And I remember one particular instance that I want to relate to you because it tells you how one's mind just quits working. At one point, while I was lying down on the floor, somebody raised the blanket and pushed in a bowl of soup. Soup, you know, the same old soup that I mentioned to you. And I peeked out, and I saw about 4 or 5 feet from me a naked foot with 5 black toes and a hand with a pair of pliers. When I say pliers, I mean kitchen pliers that, you know, that went like this, picking off the toes. And I pulled in my soup and ate it with tremendous enjoyment. This did nothing to me. My mind had gone dead, okay? So 5 toes were picked off, so what? So anyway, to make a long story short now, really, time went by, I went back to work, and the 8th of May arrived. On the 8th of May, we stood lined up to be counted, to march out again, to drill those holes into bedrock. And I looked to the towers. There were every 200-300 feet, wooden towers, the machine gun on top, the big reflector to light up the camp at night. No soldiers. Those towers were empty. There was nobody up there. But you see, when your mind doesn't work, when your information comes in, there's nothing there to process it. I mean, information always has to be processed before you understand what it's all about. Well, I couldn't process it anymore, and so we just stood there like a bunch of cows, feeding. Except we weren't feeding. We were hungry. So we wait. And then the triple gate of the fence opens. There were 2 tall fences and 1 inner fence with a high voltage wire on which a good many people actually suicided themselves. Couldn't take it anymore. They sneaked out during the night, touched the wires, and we saw them hanging there on the wires in the morning. Well, anyway, the gates opened, and the SS commander, all alone, comes in, talks to the camp commander, the prisoner commander, and they exchanged a few words. Then the SS commander turns around, leaves through the same gates, and takes off the key ring with big keys hanging down and throws that over the fence back into the camp. We stand there. We have no idea what's going on. No idea. Afraid to move. And then we heard an engine sound coming closer and closer and closer. It was a tank, a single tank, a Soviet tank, with a soldier in the turret of the tank. And that tank smashed the fence on one side of our camp, just rolled in, just smashed the whole thing, and went on all by itself. And we still did not understand what was going on. Absolutely. And then, after perhaps I'm estimated in half an hour, the guy next to me said, "I think it's over," he said. "Let's go and try organizing some food." That was a jargon, concentration camp jargon. Organize meant get some food one way or another. Just get it. And so we left these rows of prisoners, and I think many of them also just stepped out, felt that something was going on, something good. And we went down to Main Street of Waldenburg, and we saw a military truck standing there. And there was nobody around, no people, totally abandoned, the whole city. And so we climbed on the truck. There were shelves on the truck with brown cans, camouflage painted cans. And this fellow who was with me produced a screwdriver from somewhere. We punched holes into the cans, pried it open, and saw white grease. But the grease smelled deliciously. It was pork grease. And as we dug into this with our hands, filling our mouths with this grease, there were chunks of pork down there. And that was even better. And so we opened can after can. I cannot tell you how many. But after the last can we opened, we saw a sack in the bed of the truck, slid it open with sugar that spilled out. We got on all fours, and we ate sugar. And then everything blanked out, and I don't know what had happened. So I woke up eventually. I'm alive. You see me here. I woke up. And just lay there in bed. And the only thing I remember was a cuckoo clock that was on the opposite side of the wall there. And I just lay there. This friend of mine was still out. And then the door opened, and a tiny little woman, I'd say maybe 4.5 feet tall, came in dressed in black. She sat down on the side of my bed. She saw me, obviously, being awake. And she said to me, jetzt ist alles vorüber, wir haben den Krieg verloren, sie sind frei, which means it's all over, we've lost the war, you are free. And I fell back asleep. You know, you just can't process this kind of stuff. And I don't know how long I was asleep again, but when I woke up the second time, well, I had made a little bit of progress, I think. The other fellow was waking up too. And now we were faced with a big, big question. What do you do now? And so we were just absolutely disgusted with the rags we had on ourselves. These were these blue-white pajama-type concentration camp clothing articles, but they were rags by now. You know, I hate to use these words, but people urinated into these things. People defecated into these things. There's nothing. I mean, this was never washed. I mean, you had this on for, I don't know how long, maybe half a year, 3 months, I don't know. It was filthy. And so we broke into the basements of these homes that had been abandoned by the Germans. And we found clothing. And we clothed ourselves. Well, I don't think I looked so good in black boots and stuff like that. But we at least were clean again. We came back to the home, to the old lady, stayed there for another day or two. And then, without being able to make any kind of a decision, because all the decisions for 3 years had been made for us. You don't know how to make decisions under these circumstances. We went back to the camp. That's the best thing we could do. And there were little fires here and there, and people were roasting, I don't know, maybe a little rabbit or whatever they caught, maybe a fish from somewhere. I have no idea. And there we were. And then women started coming to the camp, and they were in their blue-white dresses, obviously also concentration camp inmates. And at one point, 3 women stood at this busted fence that the tank had flattened. And I was so shy, you know, incredible. I was 18 years old. I walked up to the ladies and said, "Excuse me, but did you by any chance, during your time in these camps, run into 1 or 2 women by the name of Ziffer?" And one of the ladies looked at me and said, "Ziffer? Well, of course. There were 2 Ziffer women in my barrack. And there was a other young woman with them." Well, I was flabbergasted, obviously. "Where is your camp? Where can I find these women?" And she said, "In Langenbielau." And you can look that up. It's a city not far from Waldenburg, about 30 kilometers from Waldenburg. And so I made my first decision. I went down to Main Street of Waldenburg. There was nobody around except for 1 bicyclist who was coming toward me. And I barred his way, and I said, "Get off the bike." We looked horrible. They knew where we were coming from, even though I had some funny clothes on, you know. He got off the bike, gave me the bike, and walked away. And I took the bike. And it took me 2 days to bicycle about what is probably 16 or 17 miles. I slept one night under the stars, and I arrived in the camp. And I said, "Where do the Ziffers live? Which barrack?" "Over there in that barrack." Walked over to that barrack, and lo and behold, the women welcomed me. And they had made much more progress than the men. They had pretty good food at that point, you know, what seemed to me to be good food. And they offered me, "Sit down, eat, you know. The Ziffers aren't here. They're out organizing food." Okay? So I sat there at a distance from here to the door. After I'd eaten, I just resigned myself to waiting. And then the door opened, and in came my mom and my sister and my cousin Ilse, who had lost both her parents in Auschwitz. And they came in, and they looked at me, sort of had a little smile on their face. I always like to say, you know, when you go to a grocery store and somebody gives you a wagon that's empty, you know, you say thank you and you smile. They smile back. That's America, by the way. So they walked right by me to the corner of the barrack and started unloading what they had organized. I walked up to my mom and I introduced myself. I'm getting a little shaky now, but it's undescribable, the joy, of course, of having found each other, you know, under these circumstances. And that was a turning point, obviously, in our lives. We stayed together for, I don't know, 3 or 4 days, where a couple of men from our area in Czechoslovakia had somehow joined us, and we started our long trek back home. It was a long and dangerous trek because the bridges had been bombed out by the Nazis as they retreated from the Allies, in this particular case, from the Soviet army. And it was dangerous because the soldiers, these Soviet soldiers, had absolutely no culture whatsoever. And believe it or not, they raped the women whom they had liberated. And we heard that from a number of peasants, farmers, who gave us shelter during this walk back home and told us, do not walk in daytime. We will keep you here in some outbuildings and what have you. We'll take care of you, give us bread and milk, sometimes a piece of meat. And then they helped us sometimes with their carts, the horse-drawn carts, to advance a few kilometers further to our hometown. When we arrived at our hometown, my mom, she was a very, very strong woman. She went to 94, by the way, 93, take it back. But we marched into this town as victors, you might say, in the middle of the street. It was a woman that recognized my mom and ran up to my mom, sad looking as can be. I can explain that later. Said, oh, Mrs. Ziffer, so you have survived? My mom said, yes, we have survived, and we plan to stay here. And the woman disappeared. And we walked a bit farther. Another woman came up with a smile from here to here and said, Mrs. Ziffer, do you know that your husband is in town already? No, we hadn't heard anything from my dad for 3 years. And so, of course, we wanted to know where. And we had had a maid before the war, a Hungarian woman, a wonderful lady whom my sister and I loved almost as much as we loved our mom. And so Malchi Kuryanova had a little apartment, and your husband, Mrs. Ziffer, is over there. And so they sent me over there to tell my dad that our family had survived. I walked up the 2 floors. Malchi Kuryanova opened the door, and we fell into each other's arms. She was happy. She had saved a few things for us, too. And then I said, where's my father? He said, in that room over there. And I walked in. My father sat in a chair in the corner of the room looking at the wall. So I told him who I was. I mean, he looked different also, quite different. He was a skeleton. He had been in Auschwitz. He showed practically no emotion. I couldn't understand that. And then I did get him to follow me, and I got him united with his wife, my mom.
So it took a long, long time before he really became back to normality. He couldn't work anymore after that. Well, I mean, as an attorney, you know, that it just wasn't possible. And I tried to do what I could to get an education. I always wanted to become an engineer. And so I went to apprentice in a automotive garage and became an automotive apprentice mechanic. And I still have this love for mechanical things to this day. And so my wife could tell you that I've repaired a lot of stuff that could have cost us a lot of money to have repaired. I could do it. I want to know how things work, but I'm not quite sure how people's brains work. That's another area. So anyway, this is really where this particular story ends. And it's been an hour and a half. And I will be happy to try to answer any of your questions, if you have any. But it so happened that communism was threatening our country, Czechoslovakia. And I had lost all this time. I had 4 grades of regular school. And so I begged my father, help me to get out. And my father succeeded and bought me a passport and a visa for France, for Paris. And I got on a train, I left my family, came to Paris, stayed in Paris just short of 2 years, waiting for a visa to come to the United States. And then was invited to come to the American embassy in Paris, close to the Place de la Concorde. And there was an American consul there who handed me my visa. And I cannot tell you what that meant to me. And he said, welcome, Walter Ziffer, come to America. We'll be happy to help you take your life from here on. And he was a wonderful person. And I'm here, and I'm eternally grateful for what America has given to me. And I hope that at age 91, doing this sort of thing, that churns me up when I come to certain portions of the story, I'm returning a little bit to the country that has done so much for me. And with that, I'll say, maybe au revoir, maybe goodbye. And I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll have a little bit of time for some questions. I don't want to keep us much longer than 8 o'clock, though. Just as a reminder, after we're done with a short question period, Walter will be happy to speak with you. We'll be right out there. He has some books, and you can, any questions, you know, I've seen him be here far too long in the evening, but he will answer them for you. So if we don't get to your question at the moment, don't feel disheartened. Meet him afterwards. So does anybody have any questions they would like to ask Walter? You can raise your hand.
I just want to know if you ever saw your family again after you came to the U.S.
Yes, yes, I have. My former wife and I, we have 4 children who were very, very little at the time. In fact, what I wanted to tell you, I have the joy of having my youngest daughter here among us. And she's right here in the second row. And she was one of the kids that went with us to Czechoslovakia at that time. I'm sure she doesn't remember that. Do you remember it? You do? Okay. I tell you one funny thing. It was very hard to find that apartment, but I won't go into that. My my dad had gone blind. I'm not sure what the causes were at that point, but when I arrived with my children, he asked me, would I tell my children to walk up to him so that he could touch their face to get an idea of what my kids looked like. Do you remember that? Yeah? And then the other thing is, Americans, children, like to drink milk, you know, for breakfast. Well, in Europe, we used to drink coffee. I mean, milk coffee. And so when I mentioned that to my parents at that time, that was the last time I saw my father, by the way, they somehow produced milk for us. And when the kids were eating cereal or something with milk, or just milk, they just stood there and watched them. Oh, kids drinking milk for breakfast? Unheard of, you know. You remember that? Okay. So really strange things. But, you know, there was communism at that time in Czechoslovakia. And my parents lived in a small apartment. We lived in some state-owned hotel. And one thing that really struck me from that experience, when we had finished eating breakfast, the waiter would come and look at the basket where the slices of bread had been, and he counted the slices that had disappeared from the basket. Now, can you imagine this happening in an American hotel? Right? Yeah, I don't think so. But that was communism, okay? And I was very smart to have left at that point after liberation. So, yes, my father died fairly shortly afterwards, but my mom came to France. I was working in France at the time, and we spent some time together. And she was heartbroken because they'd had a wonderful marriage. And then at one point, I was teaching in Belgium, in Brussels, and they came to Brussels once. And so I had an opportunity to, you know, to see my mom and my sister 3 or 4 times after liberation. And I invited them. I was an engineer for General Motors at that time, and I invited them to come to America, but they just didn't have the courage to do that. You know, my father was, I think, in his 60s at that point, or maybe no, older than that. And you know, to begin a brand new life in a foreign country, it just didn't see it as a possibility. I understand that. So we exchanged letters, and I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that I received a letter every week from them, and I responded every week. I had piles of letters, because we were a family that whose members were very close to each other. We did things together. We went into the mountains together before the war, obviously. And of course, all that collapsed with the Nazi invasion.
Hi, Walter. How did you get settled when you came to the United States? Did you have family or friends or your work that helped you get settled?
Well, I was able to come, excuse me, to the United States well, by two groups of people, you might say, who helped me. I had an uncle in Nashville, Tennessee, and that's where I eventually landed in America, who was a chemical engineer, who had left Europe 1 or 2 days before the Nazi invasion, before the outbreak of the war. So my uncle Bruno and his wife Marianne helped me, but there was a Jewish organization called the Joint Distribution Committee. Some of you may have heard of that group, which is to some extent an organization that helped in those days Jewish Holocaust survivors, especially, to emigrate to the United States or to Israel or to Australia. And so between these two helping groups, I was able to come here, and I arrived in America in December 1948. I mean, you know, I could just keep on telling you stories, but I wanted to become an engineer. How do you become an engineer having had 4 years of grammar school? That's sort of hard to do. Well, there was Vanderbilt University is in Nashville. And the wife of my uncles was a stunningly beautiful woman. So bringing all this together, she took me to the dean of engineering at Vanderbilt and said, well, here's my little nephew, would you take engineering? And he said, well, no. I had about 2 quarters of high school prior to that moment. So I had, I don't know, maybe 6 credits, and I needed 16 or 26 or whatever. I don't remember. So he said no. And so I have to say, Mary Ann, who is no longer with us, flirted with him. And he seemingly was receptive. And so the outcome was, I will take your little nephew. If he passes his first quarter, he can stay. If he doesn't pass it, he's got to go back to school, to high school. And this is what happened. And my first quarter wasn't brilliant. You know, I made some C's, maybe a D. I think I still have that card, the report card somewhere. But I made it, you know. And then I was in engineering, and that wasn't easy either. I mean, I never had algebra, for instance. And when I came in, they were studying, what is it, space geometry or something like that. Yeah, I was lost. And so my uncle and his wife really worked with me practically day and night. In English, we did, was it, no, what was it? I don't remember now, my gosh. It wasn't Hamlet, it wasn't the German, the Merchant of Venice. What's the other real famous play by Shakespeare? Hmm? Well, anyway, pardon? Romeo and Juliet? No, no. No. That would have been too dangerous for me. But anyway, I studied very, very hard and really prepared myself for that exam. I knew what it would be. The teacher would say, okay, then the name of the play that had been announced, and then act so-and-so, scene so-and-so. No, that's the other way. No, she read a text and then asked us in what act and scene it was. And just phonetically, I remembered some of these things. I'm glad I wasn't there 91 years old, because my memory is no good anymore. So, you know, I did some guessing, and some of it I knew, and I passed. But what I want you to know is that all these teachers at Hume Fogg Technical and Vocational High School in Nashville, Tennessee, were absolutely wonderful human beings. They knew where I was coming from. They realized it. They gave me some leeway. And they were just good to me. You know, and that's really the key to a population in a country. It is goodness. We need goodness. I'm not a particularly religious person. And my former wife was very upset by my son not going to church or to synagogue. He wasn't interested in religion. And so my former wife, Carolyn, who is a Tennessean from Franklin, Tennessee, who lives now in Gainesville, Florida, she was worried about this. And she said to my son, how are you going to know what's right and what's wrong if you don't go to Sunday school, if church doesn't give you some grounding, or synagogue doesn't give you some grounding? And he said, Mom, I don't need that. I've learned from you goodness, and that is good enough for me. I know what I'm doing. Goodness. I'll never forget that. She told me that, actually. Yeah, I mean, his mother. So let's get a little goodness in our society. That would be helpful. Thank you.
Hi, Walter.
Hi, Adrian.
You stated
Talk
that...
fairly loud, please. A little louder.
Louder? You said that after the Germans knocked down the fence and you got out of the camp, you went to the town and had all that food. But you went back to the camp. Why didn't you just continue on or stay in the town instead of going back to the camp? First question. Second question.
Well, let's answer that
Okay.
one first, because by the time you give me a second question, I'll have forgotten first one. So, no, I think what I try to convey to you is that we were no longer we were no longer able to make decisions, because decision making requires some logical thought patterns, which we didn't have. If you don't make a decision for 3 years at that age, you just don't know how to make them. Now, at the camp, I at least had some people I knew. I didn't want to be surrounded just by Germans who may have been Nazis. And I'm sure there were some Germans there, Nazis that were in hiding. I mean, I didn't run into it, except the one on the bicycle. You know, I don't know who he was or what he was. So that is my answer. We were lost. We didn't know what to do with ourselves. Question 2?
You have an incredible sense of humor. And I'm fascinated with all that you've gone through, how that comes to be.
Can you repeat that for me?
You've had a warm sense of humor. How has that happened through all your experiences and kept?
Well, you know, I've heard some other Holocaust speakers, and so has my wife, who is there somewhere in the last row. And I think maybe in both cases or 3 cases, these people had not recovered from that experience. They choke up, or I choke up a little bit too. But they choked up, they started crying, etc., etc. I have been able to sort of control myself. One reason being that when I speak here, I do not speak here just as a Holocaust survivor, but also as a scholar. I've studied this, and so I can put some distance between what happened and what I know. That is one reason. The other reason is something that somebody else said that I am just repeating now. Hitler wanted to destroy our lives. I think we all know that. Not trying hard enough to recover and remain optimistic and have a sense of humor. In other words, continuing in one's destroyed state is giving Hitler a posthumous victory. And I will not do that. And I will be positive. And I won't. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we are running a little close to time, so I want to end on, I think, that note. If you have any questions, please meet with Walter afterwards. I will just say one short thing, that take this experience of what you've had, share this with someone else. We've streamed this, show it to someone. Tell them when someone accuses a race or a group of people of things that hasn't actually been attested to them, tell them that you can inform yourself. Show them what's going on in the world. Share Walter's experience with them, because there will be people eventually in life who say, well, the Holocaust didn't happen. It's already happening around us, and you know, in this day and age, it's about who yells the loudest for what truth is, unfortunately. If you are moved by this tonight, please join us tomorrow. Walter will hopefully be with us in the Haynes building. There's may not want to. There is free food, so, you know.
Maybe.
Please join us, and we will contribute and edit back to the world and give back to so many people who have helped expand the Holocaust. Walter Ziffer, one more time.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.